Let's go ahead and get started. I just want to welcome everyone to today's webinar with the Natural Areas Association. My name is Sarah Pierce. I work in programming with NAA, and I'm real pleased that you are able to join us today. I'm going to share a little bit about the Natural Areas Association. We're a member-supported nonprofit. We're over 40 years old, and we provide networking, training, and advocacy for natural areas professionals, including you. We bring you the latest science and best practices to support your work in natural areas management. And we do this by publishing the Natural Areas Journal, which is a peer-reviewed quarterly publication. We also host regional workshops all across the country on topics that are relevant to the work that you do. We host the annual Natural Areas Conference, and we also host webinars like this one. I encourage you to visit our website, naturalareas.org, to learn more about what we do and consider joining us. You can also talk to a colleague who's a member of the Natural Areas Association to learn more about how we support your work. We have several upcoming webinars. We've got another one coming up next Tuesday on a couple of programs with the Institute for Applied Ecology that they run with incarcerated populations propagating native plants for ecological restoration. So you'll want to join us for that. Please visit our website to register. We have another webinar with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation coming up at the end of the month. That's June 30th. And that one's on conserving bumblebees in our natural areas with Rich Hatfield. So again, please check out our website to read the abstracts and register for those webinars. We also added a video archive of our previous webinar, the one that happened on May 26th with Tom Kay from the Institute of Applied Ecology. Tom gave us a great presentation on how to select native seeds for ecological restoration, so please check that out on our website as well, naturalareas.org. NAA will host our 47th National Natural Areas Conference this fall. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the conference will be in a virtual format and not an in-person meeting. Please stay in touch with us by checking our website and joining our mailing list for more details as we move forward with planning that event. And now I'll hand it over to our Executive Director, Lisa Smith.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everybody. I just wanted to say a few words today about our sponsors for this webinar. This is one of a number of webinars that we've been offering that focus on the importance of pollinators in natural areas management. These specific webinars are made possible and free to you through the generous underwriting of our partners at the U.S. Forest Service and through the in-kind support of our partners at the Xerces Society. We're fortunate here at NAA to be able to make webinars like this one today free of charge to you. But not all are underwritten, and so we'd like to encourage those of you who find this type of programming of value to become members of NAA. It's one of the ways that you can support us so that we are able to continue to offer this type of valuable resource for you. As you know, times are changing for all of us, and while NAA will not waver from offering important information in support of our community, we're faced with the challenge of funding this work. And I think you'll see in the near future that a membership in NAA will bring with it even more benefit for those of you working in natural areas conservation. And thanks to those of you who are members, we look forward to continuing to serve you. It's my pleasure to introduce and welcome our presenter today. Candace Fallon is a senior conservation biologist at the Xerces Society of Invertebrate Conservation, where she leads Xerces Firefly Conservation Campaign and serves as co-chair of the North American section of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Firefly Specialist Group. She's a lead author of the Xerces Society's Conserving the Jewels of the Night, Guidelines for Protecting Fireflies in the United States and Canada. And we're making these guidelines available to you. Sarah will be sharing the link with you in chat momentarily. So Candace, the floor is yours.
So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. Like Lisa just said, my name is Candace, and I'm a biologist at our Endangered Species Program here at Xerces. And today I'm just going to be presenting on fireflies. I'll be covering some basic life history and background information on fireflies and talking about some of the threats that they face. And then I'll be going over some more specific recommendations for how natural areas professionals like yourselves can help fireflies and protect them and their habitat. So before we begin, I just want to say thank you again to Sarah and Lisa and the NAA for sponsoring or coordinating this webinar, and also to all of our supporters and donors for the Xerces Society, our members, and the many different firefly researchers and community scientists who really share their time and knowledge with us over the last couple years, and on which a lot of this presentation is built. So we really couldn't do this work without you all. Similar to NAA, we are a donor-supported nonprofit, so if you'd like to support our work, please become a member, and thank you as well to our current members. If you're not familiar with the Xerces Society, we are a science-based nonprofit dedicated to the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. So we were established in 1971 by Robert Michael Pyle, and we're named after the Xerces blue butterfly, which is thought to be the first US butterfly to go extinct due to human activities. And this is a butterfly that was once found in the Bay Area of California. Xerces now has over 50 employees all over the country, and we do everything from education and outreach to applied research. We work on policy, we do restoration, and this is through our 4 main programs for pollinator conservation, endangered species work, pesticide reduction, and then a community engagement program. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into fireflies. And bear with me if some of this is a review of things you already know, but I always like to kind of start off with an overview of what fireflies are. So fireflies, which are also called lightning bugs or glowworms, are not flies and they're not worms and they're not bugs. They are in fact beetles. And so they are distinguished by having this first pair of wings really hardened and thickened, like you can see in this photo here. And these 4 wings really serve as a protective shield for the more delicate wings underneath. And those are the ones that they use to fly with. So fireflies are a really widespread group. They're actually found on every continent except Antarctica. It's kind of easy to think of fireflies as maybe just a couple different species, but we actually have about 170 different described species in the US and Canada. As you can see from this map, fireflies are found in 49 US states, so all of the states except Hawaii, and in many Canadian provinces and territories. And so the darker green on this map that you see, that's represents more species reported from that area. And it's likely that some areas are underreported for species just because there haven't been as many. And all the little black dots on here are records that we've been collecting in our database, just kind of showing the spread of fireflies. So those of you who live in the West, like I do, I'm based in Portland, Oregon, you might be a little surprised to see that we do actually have fireflies out west. Of course, this may mean different things. So not all fireflies actually flash. And when we think of fireflies, we usually think of them flashing. We have memories of maybe a summer night as a kid chasing fireflies, watching fireflies with families or friends. And the larvae of all firefly species do glow, but not all adults produce light. So this picture here in the center is a firefly on a basil plant. And these are probably the best known. When we say fireflies, we think of these flashers. But beetles, like fireflies, are really diverse, and they have really different life histories, different habitat associations, and different courtship behaviors. So actually, all 3 species that you see on the screen are adult fireflies, and each one of them uses a pretty different form of communication. So we have our kind of typical flashing firefly on the basil, and then on the top left, we have a pink California glowworm, which glows. And then on the bottom left, we have a day active species. So these typically do not produce light and they're active during the day. And it's thought that a lot of these species probably use pheromones, these chemical cues that they send out rather than light to communicate. So these more conspicuous flashing species that we all think about tend to occur primarily in the Midwest and the Eastern US and Canada. We do have some kind of localized pockets of flashing fireflies in the West. There have been reports from Utah, Nevada, Arizona, a few other places. So they are out here, they're just not quite as abundant or frequently seen. But probably our most famous flashing fireflies are species like the synchronous fireflies. And these are the ones that light up sometimes by the thousands in places like the Great Smoky Mountains. And the male fireflies will actually end up synchronizing the period of time in which they flash. So they all start at the same time and then they all stop at the same time. And they wait for female responses. And when you have many, many, many fireflies doing this in a single place, it's a pretty spectacular sight. Out west, glowworms and day-active fireflies make up the majority of our firefly fauna. And so glowworms, similar to flashing fireflies, are active at dusk or at night, but they glow instead of using flashes or flickers to communicate. So males look like your typical firefly. This picture on the left is a male, and I'm not really sure what he's doing with his wings, but overall, a fairly typical looking firefly. Females, on the other hand, are really interesting. They actually resemble larvae. And so this picture on the right is actually an adult female. And these females cannot fly. Glowworm females either have no wings or they have really reduced wings. And so you can see from this photo that she has some tiny wing pads that haven't fully developed. So she's basically just bound to the ground. She can only move as far as her legs can take her. And these two communicate for the most part with glowworms. Females glow from the ground, and then males are flying overhead searching for those glows. Although there are a few exceptions, like the blue ghost fireflies out east, the males do produce light and kind of glow for these long periods searching for females. Our daytime dark fireflies, like their name suggests, are active during the day. And like I said, they most likely use pheromones to communicate, although this has only been shown in a few different species. But we are assuming or guessing that this is probably true for a lot of other species. So this species on the left is a winter firefly, Elychnia. And this is a pretty common firefly that can be seen across the country. And it may be one of the earliest fireflies that you see, especially if you're in a more northern region. I know I typically start seeing them out here probably as early as March or April in some years. They can be active really early. And these species actually will overwinter on tree trunks. Some people can find them in February. So like all beetles, fireflies undergo complete metamorphosis. They have 4 stages with the egg, the pupa, larva, and adult. And the larvae and the pupae of many species live underground. There are some exceptions to this, but these larvae, as well as the flightless female glowworms, all typically live on or are under the ground. And as larvae, the fireflies are really voracious predators of other soft-bodied invertebrates. So their diet consists primarily of things like snails and slugs, earthworms, other soft-bodied organisms. You can see in this picture that this is actually, I believe, a European species, but I couldn't find a good photo of one of our native species here in the States eating a snail. So fireflies actually spend the majority of their lives as larvae, and this can be up to 2 years or maybe even more, depending on the latitude and location, whereas adults live typically only a few weeks. So larvae spend most of the time on the ground, like I said, but there are exceptions like this Pyractomina larva. They'll actually climb up the sides of trees and they look for this deeply furrowed bark and they'll seek shelter in here, and this is where they'll pupate. So we do have some interesting kind of arboreal species as well as the ones that are typically found on the ground. Fireflies are probably best known for their light. And so this is produced through a chemical reaction involving an enzyme called luciferase. And light is produced when oxygen combines with a chemical luciferin, ATP, and magnesium ions, and it's all in the presence of this enzyme. So this bioluminescence is thought to have evolved as a warning signal, originally with larvae and also adults, kind of as a warning to predators that they don't taste good, they're toxic. But over time, it's thought that adults started co-opting this signal for a courtship signal. And so all firefly larvae do produce light, but like I said, not all adults do. And even eggs of some species glow as well. Depending on the species and the location, different fireflies will actually emit different wavelengths or different colors of light. So if you think you're seeing different colors at night as you're looking at fireflies, these can range from green and yellow to more orange or even a more amber color. And it really has to do with what time they're active and ensuring that their light can be seen against the background vegetation or whatever else is happening in their landscape. So this ability to produce light is pretty neat, and it's not restricted to fireflies, but this enzyme that is involved, luciferase, really caught the attention of researchers decades ago. And there has been a lot of scientific and biomedical advances using this enzyme. And so now researchers, they have a synthetic version that they use in the lab, and they're able to do everything from visualizing HIV transmission to detecting bacterial contamination in foods, such as milk and meats and other things like that. So although most adult fireflies do not eat, there are a few exceptions to this. And again, their bioluminescence comes into play here. So there's a genus of fireflies called Photuris, and the females of this genus, once they've mated, will mimic the call or the flash pattern of another species and will actually use this to lure in males of the other species, and then they'll eat them. So a lot of fireflies contain these toxic compounds, which is what makes them distasteful to predators. But the Photuris species lack these compounds, and so the females are actually taking them in from their prey and sequestering them and then passing them on to their young so that they too will be protected by these compounds. Other than this, other feeding activity by adults has not been observed very much. There are some researchers like Lynn Faust who have been documenting fireflies actually feeding on nectaries and flowers of some species. So far, the plants that have been documented include things like milkweeds, goldenrod, asters, some of our later season flowering species. Others have observed fireflies congregating at maple sap. So this might be a secondary moisture source used by fireflies. But overall, we don't think adults eat that much. Larvae, on the other hand, are very hungry. They are voracious predators. And like I said, they seek out these soft-bodied invertebrates. And because of this, they can be really valuable predators of crop or garden pests. And firefly larvae eat by actually first injecting their prey with this paralyzing venom, which immobilizes it, and then they continue eating from there. Fireflies are also prey for a number of other species, mostly invertebrates. Again, a lot of them have these toxic compounds and these warning colors and this bioluminescence that all warn predators to stay away because they're distasteful. But a number of other species have worked their way around this, and this includes things like spiders and assassin bugs, and of course, other fireflies in this genus Photuris. So fireflies can be found in a really wide variety of habitats. Anything from these riparian woodlands to coastal sand dunes. They can be found in desert river canyons, obviously, urban backyards, crop fields. There are many, many places where fireflies can be found, some of which can be pretty surprising. But the one thing that really is in common with all of these places is some form of humidity, whether that's dew or a permanent or ephemeral water source. It's really important that fireflies have some source of moisture so that they don't dry out. So fireflies, I like to think, are definitely some of our most celebrated insects. It's hard to find a person who doesn't love fireflies. But you may have heard recently that it sounds like they are declining. We keep seeing reports of declines, and they're mostly anecdotal. We don't have a lot of baseline monitoring data on fireflies, although that's definitely starting to change. But the general consensus of people we talk to and people we hear from is that they're seeing fewer and fewer fireflies each year. And some firefly researchers agree that they're also seeing fewer fireflies at research sites and just working generally. So we don't really know the full extent of these declines, especially here in the US and Canada, but we do have some ideas about what might be driving declines, or at least potential declines. And so earlier this year, members of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, Firefly Specialist Group published this perspective piece in Bioscience. And it was basically trying to compile all the perceived threats to fireflies in different regions of the world. And this piece was based on a poll put together and sent out to experts all over the world. And collectively, the three largest threats to fireflies are thought to be habitat loss and degradation, light pollution, and pesticide use. And then, the list continued on from there. There were other threats like declining water quality, invasive species, climate change, increased severity and frequency of things like storms and droughts, and all of that. So I'm just going to talk about those first three threats briefly here, but habitat loss and degradation is definitely considered one of the largest threats to most declining insect species worldwide. And this can take a lot of different forms. It includes commercial and residential development, groundwater pumping, water pollution, any kind of modification of waterways or fragmentation. And this picture here actually shows what was once thought to be the largest population of a firefly species known as the Bethany Beach firefly. And this is a critically endangered species that we petitioned to have listed under the Endangered Species Act with the Center for Biological Diversity last year. But as you can see, there's kind of urban infill and development, and this boardwalk has been built right in the middle of their habitat here, which, just given the lack of light and the cutting down of the plants and drying out of the site, it's probably going to be really detrimental to fireflies there. Light pollution is also a really big threat to fireflies. Probably 3/4 of our firefly species here in the US and Canada are nocturnal, or they're active at dusk. And so they really rely on these bioluminescent light signals to communicate with each other and to find mates. So a growing body of research is showing that artificial light at night from things like street lamps and buildings, residences, other sources are actually obscuring these light signals that fireflies use to communicate. And so this potentially has really bad implications for fireflies. Obviously, if you can't communicate with each other, you can't find each other, you're not reproducing, you're not having the next generation of fireflies. So in these photos, you can see on the left here is just the night skyline of Chicago. And then on the right is a photo taken from space at night. And you can see that, obviously we are much more populated in the eastern US, but this is also where a lot of our more flashing species of fireflies exist. So there's really this added pressure on fireflies in the east. The third A major threat is pesticide use, and this includes both insecticides and herbicides. And again, this has also been implicated in the decline of a lot of different invertebrate species. Fireflies can be exposed to pesticides directly in their habitat through runoff. They can also take in insecticides through things like their prey. So obviously, even things affecting the populations of their prey can also be an issue for fireflies. And herbicides too can degrade their habitat or remove important resources for them. So these threats probably feel a little overwhelming, but there are a lot of things we can do for fireflies. Okay, so things you can do to help fireflies. A really critical one is limiting ground disturbance. And this is because firefly larvae and the females of many species, especially species like glowworms, but others as well, they spend most of their time on the ground. So when possible, just leaving places undisturbed, and a lot of you are probably doing this already, but allowing leaf litter and things like rotting logs to stay in place. This provides shelter not only for fireflies, but a lot of other species as well, including prey for fireflies, which is important. Leaves are also natural fertilizers, and they can also improve the moisture content of the soil, which, as we were talking about, is important to fireflies as well. Some species will use rotting logs for shelter or to hunt for prey or overwinter. Underground burrows, rocks and stones, and other microhabitats are also really important. Some species even are found in ant nests, which is pretty cool. So limiting foot traffic and other machinery and vehicles through firefly habitat is going to be really important. So considering how those might move through your landscape. And then also, if you mow, this might not apply to a lot of you, but really limiting the frequency and the area that you mow. Maybe putting your blades up higher so they don't cut as close to the ground. But both the trampling from the machinery itself and the blades can directly kill fireflies. And males and some females as well will use taller grasses and forbs as places to rest or even signal from. So it's nice to have kind of these different heights of plants available to them. You can protect existing habitat from trampling and other threats like that by using signage or creating barriers or pathways or even boardwalks, depending on what kind of habitat you have. And these can all help guide visitors through the space in a way that allows them to enjoy the fireflies and the habitats there and the other wildlife, but also protecting the species. So in areas too that receive a lot of visitation, especially related to fireflies, and we've been seeing this grow more and more as people get more excited about fireflies and seeing them at night. Maybe consider regulating the number of visitors, or maybe even employing some sort of trained guides to kind of lead people through the space and talk about what it is there. You could also determine if there are opportunities for restoring or enhancing firefly habitats. So keep in mind that fireflies use a lot of different habitats, like I mentioned, from open meadows to forests and these desert landscapes where you may not expect to see fireflies. But some species are very particular specialists, whereas others are generalists that will be found in many places. And so kind of getting to know what species occur in your area and what habitats are important to them will be really helpful in determining how you kind of restore degraded habitat. And so this photo shows a rare habitat type. It's an interdunal swale, and this relates back to that Bethany Beach firefly that I mentioned in Delaware. They actually use these kind of damp spots behind the sand dunes as their habitat. So maybe not a place that is often thought of as firefly. So I've been getting a lot of questions lately about specific species of plants to plant for fireflies, and there's not really a good answer for this. I think the more important thing to keep in mind is making sure you have a diversity of native species that are appropriate for the habitat that you're working with. And so just some general considerations to keep in mind. So grasses, like I mentioned, they help provide cover for larvae and the flightless females. And they also give female fireflies a better vantage point. So they might crawl up to the top or even fly to the top of a leaf blade and look for males. Males may rest there during the day. Flowering forbs, very similar. They provide shelter and resting places. And like I said, some species have been documented actually nectaring or feeding on some of these flowering plants. And so you could kind of test that out and see if you get any fireflies nectaring on some of your milkweeds or asters. Shrubs and trees are important in some landscapes as well. And again, this just adds additional shelter and perches. Depending on the species of fireflies that you have, different species will actually partition out through the landscape. And so some species are found primarily in tree canopies, whereas others may move pretty low to the ground. Others prefer kind of shrub heights. So having a diversity of this will help fireflies in your area. And things like trees can be really helpful as well to help block out light pollution. So if you're in an urban area or close to one that has a lot of artificial light at night, this can kind of help create that dark space that fireflies need. Water sources are really, really important for fireflies. And these can be susceptible to damage from things like livestock and even recreational use, especially with things like bank erosion. Some firefly species are actually found along the edges of these rivers and streams and other water bodies. So just being mindful that, they might be existing there. Things like drawdowns for agriculture and other modifications to these sites can alter their function. It can, over time, even eliminate the water source, which would be pretty detrimental to fireflies in the area. So really limiting their use and creating barriers to protect more fragile water ecosystems can really help protect fireflies. And kind of interesting, in the West, we have been seeing that a lot of the at least the flashing firefly populations that we have pockets of seem to be associated with these permanent water sources and even things like hot springs, which can get a lot of recreational use. So just keeping things like that in mind will be really important. So whenever possible, we do recommend that pesticide use be avoided, except for situations where you're facing economic damage or public health risks. But really, we urge people to consider non-chemical alternatives, and definitely eliminating any cosmetic use of pesticides in firefly habitats and other wildlife habitat as well. So you can be really targeted with your applications if you need to use pesticides by spot treating or using an early detection system. But I think it's important to keep in mind that pesticide use can impact not only fireflies and their habitat, but also their prey, things like snails and slugs and worms. So that's really important to keep in mind as well. And then again, these dusk and nighttime active fireflies really need dark nights. So eliminating artificial light at night will be really critical for these species. And this may not apply to a lot of natural areas, but if you do have building lights on at night and it's possible to turn them off and have that still be a safe place, then definitely doing so would help fireflies and other nocturnal species as well. If you do need light for some sort of practical or safety reason, consider using motion detectors or really targeting your light so it only lights up like a pathway or a road and not the habitat around that area. If you are having people come out to look at fireflies at night, just keeping in mind that things like flashlights and headlamps and photography and cell phones, like these are all additional sources of light that can confuse and drown out the light signals that fireflies put out. So just curtailing that as much as possible. And we have a few more recommendations. These are two Firefly-friendly fact sheets that we put together, one in English and one in Spanish, with Evelyn Owens and the Fireflies International Network. And then we also had a wonderful person, Phila, translate the Spanish one for us. So these are both available on our website. They can be downloaded. But I guess ultimately, what I'd like to say about Habitat for Fireflies is that really preserving natural areas so that they do remain natural and wild and dark and chemical free is going to help fireflies and obviously a whole host of other species as well. So really to help fireflies, if you can embrace this diversity of habitats and kind of think about those 4 key things that they need, you know, moisture, food, shelter, and dark night. And this image on the screen is a kind of hypothetical scene of fireflies at dusk, kind of depicting some of these elements that they need. You know, you have your water source, you have some leaf litter and a little burrow, you have places for fireflies to perch, you have multiple canopy layers, you have kind of this deeply furrowed bark for some of the species that are more arboreal. So Jane Kim, she's an artist based out of San Francisco, and her team with Inkdwell created this for us. And this is also part of our conservation brochure, which is available on our website. So I want to emphasize that we still have a lot to learn about fireflies. You know, everything from where they live to how they're impacted by threats. I encourage you as you work to protect fireflies and learn more about fireflies at your sites or at your homes. You know, share your findings, share them with land managers and other researchers and with visitors. We really know very little about a lot of our Western species. Some more information about that would be really helpful as well. And the more information we gather, obviously, the better recommendations we can make over time for people managing sites for fireflies. And so one really good way to contribute to this is actually by participating in community science or encouraging your visitors to participate in community science. And you know, these can be also really helpful for learning more about what species might occur in your area. There's a few active programs. Probably the largest one is Mass Audubon's Firefly Watch. And this asks volunteers just to spend 10 minutes a week observing fireflies at a site that they adopt. And this can be your yard or, you know, a local natural area. And you just send in observations, say like how many flashes of what type you saw in that 10-minute period. So as you can see, most observations are in the east, and this corresponds to where flashing fireflies occur. But we are starting to get some more reports out west. And they also rolled out a new program, Firefly Pro, this year, if you really want to dive in deep and collect a lot more information. And then out west, there's the Western Firefly Project, which is also tracking flashing fireflies. And this was started with the Natural History Museum of Utah and has now expanded to include all Western states. This is another great source for seeing where flashing fireflies might be occurring in the West. And then Firefly International Network, they have an iNaturalist platform for all these different regions around the world, but they also have one for the US and Canada. And so this is nice because it's not tracking just flashing fireflies. You can submit a photo of any firefly. You know, people will ID it for you. You'll get vetted with your IDs, and it's a really great way to learn more about fireflies and practice your ID. And these resources as well are really helpful for learning Firefly ID. Lynn Faust has a book for the Central and Eastern US and Canada. Sarah Lewis has Silent Sparks, which talks more generally about fireflies, but then also has kind of a guide to the most commonly seen genera at the back. And then Larry Bushman, he's a researcher out of Kansas, and he has this draft guide to Western fireflies, which a lot of the reports are focused more around Kansas and Colorado, but he talks about others as well. And then the Fireflies International Network is a great place to learn more about fireflies, not just in the US and Canada, but globally. And they have regional firefly guides for all over the world. So I just wanted to encourage you to check out the Firefly pages on the Xerces website. We talked about a lot of these in our talk today. And a lot of this presentation and the information I discussed actually comes from our conservation guidelines, Conserving the Jewels of the Night. And I know Sarah's been kind of plugging in a lot of the links to these in the chat as well. But everything that I've mentioned so far today should be included on the website. Feel free to email fireflies@xerces.org, and I'm happy to answer other questions that we don't get to today.
Great. Thank you, Candace. Thank you, everybody. We're going to turn now to your questions. I'm going to leave Candace's closing slide up there just in case you want to grab her email address. But we have several questions about managing for fireflies. In particular, is there any research on the increased use of LED lights and the effects that they have on fireflies?
There is definitely a growing body of research on lighting and their effects on fireflies, including, I believe, LEDs, but other lights as well. And so a lot of that research has been done by folks like Avalon Owens out of Tufts University. And so I'm happy to share some papers about that if anyone wants to reach out and ask for those. But she's been finding that different fireflies see different wavelengths of light, and there aren't necessarily any one wavelength that is not impactful to fireflies, but it seems based on her research and others' research that red light or amber light is kind of the least harmful, at least for species in the US that she's looked at. And so we have been recommending to folks that if they are going to have lights on at night, if they can put a red filter over it or actually buy red bulbs instead of LED lights, which have been shown to be really detrimental to fireflies.
Okay, great. Thank you for that additional info. Is there you mentioned wavelengths, is there any any evidence that fireflies have adapted to increase light levels by changing their flash patterns or wavelength frequencies?
There has been at least one study, and there might be more, looking at that. And yeah, it looks like fireflies, at least for some species, will actually change their behaviors. And they might, flash brighter or longer to kind of make up for this light pollution that's occurring in their habitat. Yeah, I think there's still a lot of room for more research there, but there are definitely some studies.
Okay. And then in terms of land management, is there a time during the year when it's best to say mow a field or do other kind of disturbance mimicking management so as not to disturb fireflies and or other insects?
Yeah, that is always, it's a great question. And I think we always get asked that, and it's hard to have kind of a one answer fits all. It kind of depends, in more tropical areas in the the southeast US, fireflies can be active year round, which makes it really hard to come up with any particular time. And as you move further north, I think probably one of the safest times to do things like mowing is probably late fall or winter, which is also kind of a weird time to be mowing, I know. But yeah, I mean, you basically, fireflies can start emerging in early spring and go through like late summer. And so you just really want to be cognizant of those larvae and the flightless females, especially that might be out on the ground. And so as much as you can limit your mowing, or, we often encourage people to do like a mosaic pattern. It's just hard because, especially with the flightless females, they can't disperse very far, no further than how far they can walk. And so just really, it's good to know what species you have so you can kind of get a better sense of what time of year they're active, depending on where you're located. I know that's not a great answer, but.
That's okay. I think that it's good reason to join those firefly watches, especially the iNaturalist watch.
Yeah.
Another question related to land management. How long does it take for fireflies to return to a disturbed habitat that's been restored? Have you seen any research on that?
Oh, I haven't seen any research on that. Um, yeah, I'd be curious to see if there is any. I and I kind of mentioned this earlier, but there are so many open areas for research with fireflies, and there's been a ton of great research done, but we just have so much more to learn about them, and especially when we're looking at more applied research about how different management activities impact them, and what kinds of restoration are helpful. I do have some kind of anecdotal stories about people restoring, like wet meadows and other wetland sites and starting to see fireflies come back in, or they take away lighting and suddenly they see fireflies again. So it looks like fireflies might move back in, but I haven't seen any, like hard data on numbers or how long it takes or anything like that.
Okay. And then what about prescribed fire? Any particular time that would be better for prescribed fire than another in terms of fireflies?
Yeah. Again, it's probably going to be when fireflies are least active and when they're kind of more underground or, seeking, taking shelter somewhere. As long as it's not, this really intense, high, hot burn, which prescribed fires often aren't. But yeah, there's still a lot we need to figure out about this.
Is there any, along those lines, is there any is there any research being done about their survival strategies while being underground?
Um, Survival strategies, like while being impacted by.
I think this more has to do with their typical life cycle. Like what are they, when they're underground, what's happening in their life cycle?
It's a great question. We think a lot of species overwinter as probably larvae or pupae, but I haven't seen much about what's happening. And I know there are some studies, like I think Larry Bushman has done some work looking at larval stages of fireflies, but I'd have to dig into it more. And it's interesting too, like we even have some species, like I mentioned, that are found in ant nests. And like, what are those fireflies doing and how are they staying safe from ants? And yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff to look into.
Do you think that fireflies could be used as indicators of healthy soils?
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. Is there a documented extinct firefly? Have we lost a species?
Not that I know of in the US. I know there have been several species documented globally, and I'm not sure how recently those happened. Um, we do have a lot of species that we think are pretty highly imperiled, and Xerces has been working with Sarah Lewis out of Tufts, and the IUCN Firefly Specialist Group, and Anna Walker, who's with IUCN and based in Albuquerque, the biopark there. And we've been doing red list assessments for fireflies to see which species might be more at risk than others. And so it's kind of been this huge effort to do this massive literature review and talk with all these experts on the IUCN Firefly Specialist Group. So yeah, we're seeing that some species, including the Bethany Beach firefly that I mentioned was petitioned, they seem to be really highly at risk. They have very few populations left. But yeah, they're hanging on right now, as far as we know.
Well, that's good to hear. Somewhat related to that, we have Melissa, who I think is in Pennsylvania. She says, I understand synchronized fireflies only occur in the Smokies and the Allegheny National Forest. Have researchers tried establishing populations in other suitable habitats throughout the Appalachians? So I'm thinking this is kind of an assisted migration question, maybe?
Yeah, I am not aware of any efforts to move them, but I will say that more and more populations are being discovered of them. And so they don't seem to be quite as restricted as we once thought. even just in the last couple of years, we've had a few more reports coming out from places like North Carolina. Definitely still in that same general region, but there seem to be pockets of synchronous fireflies kind of scattered throughout.
Okay, that's good to know. So maybe referring folks back to some of the Firefly Watch projects and iNaturalist that might be mapping occurrences. Cool. So we've got a bunch of questions coming in here. Are there any specific reasons why there would be more fireflies in Florida? I'm guessing, well, either more species or larger populations.
Yeah, there are quite a few species in Florida, like you saw on that map. And generally, as you move closer to the equator, like the tropics tend to have a much higher diversity of fireflies. There's just, I think the conditions are better for fireflies. And you think, Jim Lloyd, who's a firefly researcher based out of Florida, and he's been studying fireflies for decades. He's said that he thinks there's a strip kind of along the Florida Georgia border, which might be the most species rich area for fireflies in the US. So yeah, there's a lot of species in Florida, and generally, I mean, it's similar to a lot of other invertebrate species groups that as you move closer to the equator into the tropics, just biodiversity in general tends to increase.
Okay, and we've got a question from a couple of kids. We've got Kara is watching with her 4 and 7-year-olds, and they want to know if fireflies go to the bathroom.
They do.
So yep. There you go. So straight from the expert, fireflies go to the bathroom. Okay, well, it looks like we've hit most of the questions that have come in. So thank you for your time, Candace. Thank you for this presentation. Thank you everyone who joined us today. Really appreciate your attendance and your interest. Please check out the Xerces Society website, the links that I shared today. The Xerces Society has many publications and management guidelines available for managers to help you think about how you can support fireflies, pollinators, even mussels all over the United States. So we encourage you to visit the Xerces Society and support them. Also visit the Natural Areas Association website and naturalareas.org. And a special thanks to our supporting partner today, the U.S. Forest Service. Thank you for your support. So once again, thank you, Candace. Thanks for your time. Thanks for the knowledge that you shared. And thank you to everyone who participated. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone.